So, for basic radio equipment, sometimes you'll hear talk about VHF or UHF rigs or HF rigs. So let me explain some of the differences between. When you start out with your first amateur radio license, you'll probably first get a VHF or maybe a VHF UHF combination rig because they're smaller and they're less expensive. They do operate with less power. They have fewer frequencies available, and they're often portable or mobile. You can put them in a car or carry them by hand. Now, they're kind of limited to line-of-sight communications. For the frequencies they use, that's how the radio waves travel, is pretty much line of sight. So in order to increase the distance that you can send your signal, amateur radio operators put repeaters up on tall buildings or on mountain peaks so that if your radio wave can make it to the repeater will receive that and then retransmit it at a higher power level. And nowadays even hams are using internet links, so you can transmit to a repeater that links up to the internet, transmit that anywhere in the world over satellites, and then back down through another amateur radio repeater so people all over the world can communicate with VHF or VHF UHF rigs. Now HF rigs I think are more fun. They have more power available and more frequencies that you can operate on and allow worldwide communication because they're not limited to line of sight communications. They can bounce radio waves or bend radio waves off the ionosphere that surrounds the Earth. Okay, so for the three classes of licenses, we have technician, general, and amateur extra. There used to be a novice class and an advanced class, but those have been phased out, and so now these are the three classes of licenses. So, some privileges that come with your license. I think most important is the freedom to operate over a wide range of frequencies, a lot of different modes, a lot of different equipment, so you can try out lots of new things. And protection from interference from others while operating your radio station. As long as you're within your regulations and your equipment is operating correctly, if something is interfering with your equipment, maybe some neighbor's weed whacker or garage door opener or something is interfering with your station, then you have the right to protection from that interference because you're a licensed station. And so you can, a lot of times hams will work with neighbors if there's some interference, and they'll help them to get it sorted out and corrected. But if it's not something that they can correct, then by law they need to stop operating that equipment so that it does not interfere with your amateur radio station. So it's nice to know you have protection as long as you have a license. There are responsibilities that come with your license. First, you're responsible to operate within the regulations and control any transmissions from your stations. That's why if you have children around or grandchildren, you need to make sure that your station is not capable of being put on the air without you being there controlling it. You're responsible to not interfere with others by allowing spurious or uncontrolled transmissions or vulgar or unethical transmissions. Okay? You're not to operate for money. That's, again, illegal in the amateur radio service. You need to keep a current address on file with the FCC. When you get your license, you have to say where your station is located, and so it's important that if you move, that you send a notification to the FCC of your new address. Your license is actually good for 10 years, and then it needs to be renewed. And of course, the FCC realizes that sometimes people, after 10 years may not be thinking about it. You might forget, and so there's actually a 2-year grace period. So as long as you renew your license within that grace period, you can renew it. If you allow it to expire, then you have to actually take the exams over again to get relicensed. And another responsibility is that by law you need to allow your station to be inspected by the FCC if they request that. Now, as long as you're operating within privileges and you're not causing any spurious interferences with other stations, they're not going to ask to inspect your station. But by law it is required that if they request that, you allow that to happen. Okay, so what kinds of transmissions will you be using? What modes can you use? Well, the most common to start out with is voice. That's the easiest. You just talk into a microphone. The microphone converts your voice into electrical signals that can be propagated from your radio. Now there's different kinds of voice modes. FM and AM are probably two that you might have heard of. They stand for frequency modulation and amplitude modulation. A third type of voice transmission is called single sideband, which is a more efficient type of transmission than AM and is used commonly. There's also CW, which stands for continuous wave, and that is Morse code transmission. It's the oldest method of radio communication and also, I think, the most fun. It's a challenge to learn the Morse code, but it provides a lot of enjoyment. It's called continuous wave because the idea is that the radio wave is always there, you just key it on or off in a pattern. Other modes are digital, which basically means we're going to use a computer to encode a signal of electricity with certain patterns, and then have the computer send the pattern of electricity to the radio to be propagated. Now, it is a law in amateur radio that signals not be encrypted so that they can't be decoded. Amateur radio signals need to always be unencrypted. Now, some of the most popular digital modes are radio teletype, or people call it RTTY or RTTY. It's an older type that's still used extensively. PSK31 is one of the newer modes, and it's becoming very popular. It takes very narrow frequency range to operate that, and so it's a very popular mode. Even slow scan television, or SSTV, can be used, and there's many digital modes. Those are just a few of them. They're invented new modes all the time. There's so many that you'll have fun trying them out for years to come. Right, so one of the problems when you are on the radio is you need to know what frequency are you on, or where are you. If you're trying to tell people where to meet you on the radio, then you can tell them one of two things. You can say, well, I'm on a certain band or on a certain frequency. So a band is really just a group of frequencies. So it's often easier to tell somebody the specific frequency you're on, but you often hear amateur radio operators talking about operating on a certain band. And they're related, and the easy way to convert back and forth is, think about if you take 300 and divide it by the frequency in megahertz, it'll tell you the band in meters. Or you can take 300 and divide it by the band in meters, and that'll tell you the approximate frequency in megahertz. Let's just list some of the amateur radio bands. These are not all of them, but this is a good number of the bands. We fortunately have operating privileges on many different bands, and different bands have different properties. Some of the frequencies will transmit, well worldwide, bouncing off the ionosphere. Others, line of sight, and so for more local communications. So it's nice to have a variety of bands. These are listed with their wavelength in meters. So 160 meters, 80, 40, 30, 20, 17, 15, 12, 10, 6, 2, even 70 centimeters. These are their associated frequencies. Now, do you notice the pattern between them? If you notice, as the band, as the wavelength gets larger and larger, the frequency is getting smaller and smaller. So they're just the opposites of each other. We can break up these bands or frequencies into ranges, frequency ranges, that have similar properties. So for example, say 300 kilohertz to 3 megahertz, we call the medium frequency band or mid frequency band. From 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz is the high frequency band. From 30 to 300 megahertz is the very high frequency band, or VHF. And from 300 megahertz to 3000 would be the UHF band. Notice it's easy to remember if you always remember they're into the threes, dividing at the threes. Now technicians, new licensed technicians, have the privilege of using voice transmissions on 2 meters, 70 centimeters, and 10 meters. They have other privileges with CW on some of the other bands, but if you're likely to start out with voice, those are probably your primary bands that you could operate. Here's another chart that just shows the same kind of breakdown into the different regions of the radio spectrum. Next lesson we'll talk about how to get information from here to there, how radio signals work. What building blocks does a radio need to make a transmitter and a receiver work? How do you modulate the radio wave, which means how do you add the information to the radio wave? And propagation, how do you send that radio signal out through the air or space by either line of sight or ground waves or sky waves?